The snowstorm raged outside, its icy winds battering the walls of Jack's cabin. Inside, the retired firefighter sat in his living room, the glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows across the room. The blizzard had isolated him for days, and the silence was only broken by the occasional crack of the logs in the fire. Then a sound pierced the stillness, a faint, desperate scratching. Jack frowned, setting down his mug of coffee. He listened carefully, and then there it was again, this time accompanied by a muffled whimper. He stood, his heart beginning to race. The sound was coming from the front door. Walking cautiously toward the entrance, Jack's eyes widened as he approached the glass door. There, framed against the swirling snow, stood a German shepherd. Her body trembled from the cold, pressed tightly against her were two tiny puppies barely visible beneath her protective stance. Frost clung to her fur, and her breath came out in visible puffs as she gazed at Jack with eyes full of desperation. Jack froze, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He knew opening the door could mean bringing trouble into his home. But as her gaze met his, something deep within him stirred. The decision he was about to make would change their lives forever. Jack's heart pounded as he stood frozen in front of the door. The storm raged behind the trembling German shepherd, her breath fogging up the frosted glass. Her body was hunched over, shielding the two tiny pups that clung to her side. Their small bodies were almost buried under the snow accumulating around them. Jack could see her ribs pressing through her fur, her coat matted with ice, and her eyes pleading, desperate and filled with a mix of fear and hope, locked onto his. "What the hell happened to you?" Jack whispered to himself, his breath misting the cold air inside the room. Instinctively, he reached for the doorknob. The moment the door creaked open, the icy wind surged into the cabin, carrying the storm's unforgiving chill. The German shepherd didn't move, her paws still planted firmly in the snow. She remained frozen in place, her gaze fixed on Jack as if unsure whether to trust him. "Come on, girl, get in here," Jack coaxed, crouching down to make himself less intimidating. "You'll freeze to death out there." The dog let out a soft whimper, glancing briefly at her pups before stepping forward, her movements slow and cautious. She nudged one of the pups with her nose, urging them to follow. The smaller of the two stumbled in the snow, its tiny legs struggling to keep up. Without hesitation, the mother gently picked it up by the scruff and carried it inside, followed closely by the second pup. As soon as they were inside, Jack shut the door behind them, blocking out the storm's relentless roar. The sudden warmth of the cabin caused the German shepherd to tremble more violently, her body adjusting to the temperature shift. Jack grabbed an old blanket from the couch and gently draped it over her and the pups. She flinched at first, but when she realized he wasn't going to harm her, she let out a long, shaky sigh and lay down near the fire, curling protectively around her puppies. Jack knelt beside her, his mind racing. The pups were tiny, their eyes barely open, and they were so frail that he could see their little chests rise and fall with labored breaths. He reached out to touch one, but the mother's low growl stopped him. It wasn't aggressive, just a warning, a reminder that she was still wary of him. All right, Jack murmured, raising his hands in surrender. "I get it. You're a good mom. You've been through hell, haven't you?" He stood and grabbed a bowl from the kitchen, filling it with warm water. Placing it near the dog, he stepped back, giving her space. She eyed him warily but eventually leaned forward, lapping at the water as her pups huddled closer to her side. Jack watched from a distance, his thoughts swirling. Where had she come from? How had she ended up in the middle of a blizzard with two newborns? Her condition suggested she had been on her own for a while, long enough to grow weak and desperate, but not enough to give up. The fact that she had made it this far, carrying her pups through the storm, was nothing short of a miracle. But now what? Jack wasn't prepared for this. He had always been a dog lover, but his life had taken a quieter turn in retirement. He hadn't had a pet in years, and the idea of caring for 3 dogs, especially ones in such dire need, was overwhelming. Still, as he looked at the mother's exhausted frame and the way she curled protectively around her pups, he knew he couldn't turn them away. "You've got a fighter spirit, I'll give you that," Jack said softly. "Guess that makes 2 of us." As the night wore on, Jack worked to make them more comfortable. He laid out towels for the pups, placed a bowl of food near the mother, and stoked the fire to keep the room warm. The German Shepherd watched him closely, her eyes tracking his every move. But as the hours passed, her posture began to relax. For the first time, she let her head rest on the blanket, her eyes fluttering shut. Jack sat in his chair, the fire crackling softly beside him, and couldn't help but feel a strange sense of purpose. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but for now, he had done what he could. And as the storm raged on outside, he made a silent promise to the mother and her pups: they were safe, and he wouldn't let anything happen to them. The next morning, Jack awoke to the faint sound of soft whimpers and the crackling fire that had burned low during the night. The storm had passed, leaving behind a blanket of snow that glistened in the early morning sunlight. He rubbed his eyes, his mind immediately shifting to the unexpected guests who had sought refuge in his home. Turning toward the fireplace, he saw the German Shepherd still curled around her pups. The pups stirred slightly, their tiny bodies wriggling under her protective embrace. The mother's ears twitched at the sound of Jack's movements, and her amber eyes opened, locking onto his. There was still a guarded look in her gaze, but it lacked the desperation of the night before. "Morning, girl," Jack said gently as he stretched and walked toward the kitchen. "Let's see if we can get you something to eat." He rummaged through his pantry, grabbing a can of chicken soup. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Jack warmed it up on the stove and carefully placed a bowl near her. She lifted her head, sniffing the air cautiously, and after a moment began to eat. The pups, sensing their mother's movement, let out small cries and tried to nuzzle closer to her warmth. Jack knelt down a few feet away, watching as she ate. "You're a tough one," he said softly. "Carrying those little ones through that storm. You deserve better than this." As the morning wore on, Jack took stock of their condition. The mother was visibly malnourished, her ribs stark against her thin frame. The pups, while frail, seemed to have enough fight in them to try to nurse, their tiny tails wagging slightly as they latched onto their mother. Jack's heart ached at the sight. He had seen his share of hardship during his years as a firefighter, but there was something uniquely heartbreaking about the quiet struggle of these animals. Deciding to help further, Jack made a quick call to the nearest veterinary clinic. "Hey, this is Jack Carter," he said when the receptionist answered. "I've got a German Shepherd and her 2 pups here. They're in bad shape. Think you could take a look at them?" The receptionist's voice was warm but firm. "Of course, Mr. Carter. We can squeeze you in this afternoon. Bring them over, and we'll do what we can." Jack hung up, relieved. He glanced at the German Shepherd, who was now licking her pups affectionately, her maternal instincts shining through despite her exhaustion. "You hear that, girl? We're going to get you some help." Getting them to the vet proved to be no small task. Jack found an old blanket and gently tried to coax the mother onto it. She hesitated, her body tense, and let out a soft growl when Jack moved too close to her pups. "It's okay," he reassured her, keeping his movements slow. "I'm not going to hurt them, I promise." After several minutes of gentle coaxing, she finally allowed him to lift her and the pups into the back of his truck. Jack secured the blanket carefully, making sure they were comfortable before driving toward town. The roads were still icy from the storm, and Jack drove cautiously, his mind racing with questions. Where had she come from? Was someone out there missing her, or had she been abandoned, left to fend for herself in the brutal cold? At the vet clinic, the staff moved quickly, their practiced hands examining the mother and pups. "She's severely underweight," the vet, Dr. Monroe, said as she ran her hands along the dog's bony frame. "But she's resilient. Her pups are lucky she made it this far." Dr. Monroe glanced at Jack, her expression thoughtful. "She's been through a lot. It'll take time for her to fully recover, but with proper care, she'll be okay." "Do you know where she came from?" Jack shook his head. "She just showed up at my door last night. I couldn't leave her out there." The vet smiled softly. "Well, she chose the right door." By the time Jack brought them back home, the mother seemed calmer. The pups, now full from their feeding at the clinic, wriggled happily as they nestled back into her side. Jack sat nearby, watching as the German Shepherd finally allowed herself to relax. She even let him sit closer, her eyes softening when he reached out to gently stroke her head. "You're safe now," Jack murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what you've been through, but you've got a place here as long as you need it." For the first time, the German Shepherd leaned into his touch, her body no longer rigid with fear. Jack felt a lump rise in his throat. He had opened the door for her out of instinct, not knowing what would come of it. But now, seeing her trust begin to grow, he realized that they had both found something that had been missing. A sense of purpose and perhaps a second chance. The days that followed brought a steady rhythm of recovery and trust. The German Shepherd, who Jack had started calling Grace, was slowly regaining her strength. Her once sunken eyes began to shine with a flicker of life, and the pups, whom he had named Snow and Ash, grew more active with each passing day. Jack spent hours sitting on the floor near the fireplace, letting Grace grow accustomed to his presence. At first, she would watch him with cautious eyes, her body tense and protective. But little by little, the walls she had built around herself began to crumble. She allowed him to sit closer, her growls softening into occasional sighs. Eventually, she even let him pet her without flinching. One night, as the wind howled outside, Jack sat on the floor, his back against the couch, watching the fire dance in the hearth. Grace lay nearby, her head resting on her paws, while Snow and Ash tumbled clumsily over each other, their tiny tails wagging. Jack couldn't help but smile at their antics. "You've got some tough little ones there, Grace," he said softly, glancing at her. She lifted her head and looked at him, her eyes full of something Jack could only describe as gratitude. He reached out slowly, his hand brushing her head. To his surprise, she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her body finally relaxing. As the days turned into weeks, Grace's transformation was undeniable. Her coat, once matted and thin, began to shine with health. Her ribs were no longer as visible, and her energy returned in bursts. She played with her pups, nudging them with her nose and watching them stumble around the cabin with tiny barks of excitement. Jack, too, found himself changing. For years, he had lived alone in the cabin, content with the quiet solitude of his retirement. But Grace and her pups had brought a new kind of life into his world. The once silent evenings were now filled with the sound of playful yips and the soft patting of paws against the wooden floor. He hadn't realized how much he had missed having a sense of purpose until now. One afternoon, as Jack chopped wood outside, he noticed Grace standing at the window, her nose pressed against the glass. Snow and Ash were playing near her feet, their tiny bodies tumbling over each other. Jack paused, wiping sweat from his brow, and waved at her. To his surprise, Grace wagged her tail, just once, but it was enough to make his heart swell. When he returned inside, Grace greeted him at the door, her tail wagging slightly as she nudged his hand with her nose. It was the first time she had approached him willingly, and Jack couldn't hide the grin spreading across his face. "Well, aren't you full of surprises today?" he chuckled, kneeling to scratch behind her ears. Grace leaned into him, her tail wagging more enthusiastically now. Snow and Ash barked happily, circling around his legs in excitement. As their bond grew stronger, Jack began to wonder about Grace's past. Where had she come from? What had led her to his door that snowy night? The questions lingered in his mind, but he knew one thing for certain: whatever her story was, it was one of survival and resilience. Grace had faced the worst of circumstances and had emerged with her pups by her side. She was a fighter through and through. That night, as they all settled by the fire, Jack looked at Grace and spoke softly. "I don't know where you came from, girl, but I'm glad you found me. You and these little ones, you're part of the family now." Grace lifted her head, her eyes meeting his. There was something in her gaze, a quiet understanding, a bond that needed no words. She let out a soft sigh and rested her head on his lap, her body completely at ease for the first time since she'd arrived. Jack felt a lump rise in his throat as he stroked her fur. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected the arrival of a stray dog and her pups to change his life so profoundly. But as he sat there, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the soft sounds of Grace and her pups, he realized that they had given him something he hadn't even known he was missing: companionship, purpose, and a renewed sense of hope. The morning sun filtered through the cabin's windows, casting golden beams across the floor where Snow and Ash playfully tumbled over one another. Grace lay nearby, her eyes half closed as she rested, but her ears perked at every small sound. Jack, standing by the kitchen counter, sipped his coffee and watched them with a sense of contentment he hadn't felt in years. But as peaceful as things seemed, a lingering question gnawed at the edges of Jack's mind: where had Grace come from? She bore the signs of a hard life: her thin frame, the faint scars along her coat, the cautious way she moved when startled. Someone had failed her, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was might still be out there. That afternoon, Jack decided to take Grace and the pups outside. The snow had begun to melt, revealing patches of frozen ground beneath. Grace stepped cautiously onto the porch, sniffing the air as if testing for danger. The pups, still unsteady on their feet, followed close behind, yipping excitedly as they explored the new world beyond the cabin. Jack smiled, watching them. "You're safe now, girl," he said softly. "Nothing's going to hurt you here." But as they ventured a little farther from the cabin, Grace suddenly froze. Her ears shot up, her body tensing as her nose pointed toward the edge of the woods. Jack followed her gaze, his own body stiffening. "What is it?" he asked, stepping closer to her. Grace let out a low growl, her hackles rising. Jack squinted into the trees, but he saw nothing. Still, the way Grace's body was positioned, protective, ready to defend, told him everything he needed to know. Something was out there. He quickly gathered the pups, cradling them in his arms as he guided Grace back toward the cabin. Once inside, he locked the door and pulled the curtain shut, his heart racing. Grace continued to pace by the window, her eyes darting toward the woods. Later that evening, as Jack sat by the fire, he couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him. Grace lay nearby, her pups nestled against her side, but she remained alert, her eyes flicking toward the door at every sound. Jack reached out and gently scratched behind her ears. "You're not just being paranoid, are you?" he murmured. "You've seen something like this before." His thoughts wandered as he stared into the flames. He couldn't imagine what Grace had been through to make her so wary. Had she been abandoned? Hurt? Jack clenched his fists at the thought. Whoever had done this to her had no right to call themselves human. The next day, Jack decided to get answers. He loaded Grace and the pups into his truck and drove into town. The local animal shelter was small but well-run, staffed by volunteers who knew most of the animals in the area. Jack approached the front desk, carrying a photo he had taken of Grace and her pups. "I found her outside my cabin," he explained to the receptionist, a kind-looking woman in her 40s named Sarah. "I was wondering if anyone's reported her missing or if you recognize her." Sarah studied the photo for a moment before shaking her head. "I don't recognize her," she said. "But dogs like her, we see them more often than we'd like. A lot of breeders out here keep dogs in terrible conditions. When they're no longer useful, they just abandon them." Jack felt a surge of anger boil within him. "You mean to tell me she was probably dumped?" Sarah nodded solemnly. "It happens more than you think. But she's lucky she found you." The drive back to the cabin was heavy with silence. Jack couldn't stop thinking about what Sarah had said. Grace had been discarded, thrown away like she didn't matter. But she did matter, to her pups, to him. And now he was determined to make sure she never felt unwanted again. When they arrived home, Grace stepped out of the truck and immediately began sniffing the air, her tail wagging slightly. Snow and Ash followed, their little legs working hard to keep up. Jack watched them, his heart swelling with both anger and hope. "You're safe now," he said firmly, looking at Grace. "No one's ever going to hurt you again." Grace turned to him, her amber eyes softening. For the first time, Jack felt that she truly understood what he was saying. And in that moment, he made a silent vow, whoever had hurt her would never get the chance to do it again. The following days passed in an uneasy calm. Grace seemed to relax a little more each day, her trust in Jack growing stronger. Snow and Ash had begun to explore the cabin with boundless curiosity, filling the quiet space with their playful barks and tumbles. Yet, despite the warmth and safety inside, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching them. It was late one evening when his unease was confirmed. Jack was sitting by the window, absently stroking Grace's fur as Snow and Ash dozed by the fire. The moonlight illuminated the snow-covered ground outside, casting long shadows across the yard. That's when he saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the woods. Jack's heart stopped. He leaned closer to the window, squinting to make out the shape. The figure was tall, cloaked in darkness, but unmistakably human. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching. "Grace," Jack whispered, his voice low. The German shepherd's ears perked up, and she followed his gaze. The moment her eyes locked on the figure, she let out a deep, guttural growl, her body tensing as she stood protectively in front of Snow and Ash. Jack quickly drew the curtains and grabbed his phone, dialing the local sheriff. "This is Jack Carter," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "There's someone outside my cabin." I don't know who, but they've been standing at the edge of the woods for a while now. The dispatcher assured him that a deputy would be sent to check the area, but Jack's grip on the phone tightened. Something about this felt wrong, too deliberate, too personal. Minutes felt like hours as Jack waited for the deputy to arrive. Grace stayed by the door, her growls low and constant, while Jack paced the room, glancing nervously at the window. Finally, headlights pierced through the darkness, and Jack exhaled in relief as the deputy's car pulled into the driveway. Deputy Miller, a tall, no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes, stepped out of the vehicle. Jack met her at the door, explaining what he had seen. "It wasn't just a random passerby," he said firmly. "They were watching us." Miller nodded, her hand resting on the holster of her flashlight. "I'll take a look around. Stay inside and keep your doors locked." Jack nodded, his gut twisting as he watched her disappear into the woods, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the trees. He stood by the window, his hands clenched into fists as he waited. Grace sat beside him, her eyes fixed on the same spot, her body coiled with tension. When Miller returned, her expression was grim. "There's no one out there now," she said, "but I did find tracks leading up to the edge of your property. Whoever it was, they were definitely watching the cabin." Jack swallowed hard. "Did you find anything else?" Miller hesitated. "There was a piece of rope tied to one of the trees. It's old, but it looked like it had been used recently. My guess is someone's been using the woods as a camp." The thought sent a chill down Jack's spine. "Do you think they'll come back?" "I can't say for sure," Miller replied, "but I'll have patrols circle this area more frequently. If you see anything else, call us immediately." After the deputy left, the cabin felt heavier than ever. Jack locked every door and window, his mind racing with questions. Who was out there? Why were they so interested in the cabin and Grace? As he settled into the armchair, Grace came to him, pressing her head against his knee. He reached down and stroked her fur, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't worry, girl. I won't let anyone hurt you or those pups." Grace let out a soft whine, her amber eyes meeting his. For the first time since she had arrived, Jack saw something in her gaze that he hadn't noticed before, fear mixed with recognition. She knew something about the person in the woods, and whatever it was, it terrified her. That night, sleep didn't come easily for Jack. He stayed by the window, his rifle resting against the wall beside him, ready for anything. Grace lay at his feet, her ears twitching at every sound, while Snow and Ash snuggled together by the fire, blissfully unaware of the danger lurking just beyond the trees. As the hours ticked by, Jack made a silent vow. No matter what, or who, came for them, he would protect Grace and her pups at any cost. They were his family now, and he wasn't about to let their second chance be taken away. The first rays of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the curtains, casting a faint light across the cabin. Jack had barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of the shadowy figure in the woods. Grace remained close to him throughout the night, her body tense and alert, while Snow and Ash slept soundly near the fire, oblivious to the unease in the air. Jack was about to pour himself another cup of coffee when Grace suddenly bolted to the front door, her ears perked and a low growl rumbling from her chest. Jack froze, his hand hovering over the coffee pot. He grabbed his rifle from the corner and slowly approached the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek outside. His stomach dropped. The figure was back, standing closer this time, just beyond the edge of the porch. "Damn it," Jack muttered under his breath. He tightened his grip on the rifle and turned to Grace. "Stay here," he said firmly, though he knew she wouldn't listen. Opening the door just a crack, Jack stepped onto the porch, his boots crunching against the frost-covered wood. "Who's out there?" he called, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "This is private property." The figure didn't move at first, but then it took a step forward, revealing a man in his 40s, his face shadowed by the hood of a tattered jacket. He carried a rope in one hand and a smirk on his face. "That's my dog," the man said, his voice calm but laced with menace. "I've been looking for her." Jack's blood ran cold. "Your dog?" he asked, his tone incredulous. "She showed up at my door half dead with 2 pups. If she's yours, why the hell did she look like that?" The man shrugged, taking another step closer. "She got out. Happens sometimes. But I'm here to take her back." Jack raised his rifle slightly, the barrel pointing squarely at the man's chest. "You're not taking her anywhere. She's not yours anymore." The man's smirk faltered, and he stopped in his tracks. "You don't know what you're dealing with, old man. That dog's trouble. She's better off with me." Jack's grip on the rifle tightened. "No, she's better off with someone who actually gives a damn. Now get off my property." At that moment, Grace appeared in the doorway, her body rigid and her teeth bared. She let out a deep, feral growl that echoed through the cold morning air. The man's smirk vanished completely, replaced by a flicker of fear. "Grace, get back," Jack ordered, but she didn't move. Her eyes were locked on the man, and for the first time, Jack realized just how much she remembered. This wasn't a stranger to her. This was someone she had escaped from, someone who had hurt her and her pups. The man took a step back, the rope falling from his hand. "You've made a mistake, old man," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "You don't know what that dog's capable of." Jack took a step forward, his rifle still raised. "The only mistake was you thinking you could come back here and take her. She's not going anywhere, and neither are her pups. Now get off my land before I make you regret it." The man hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking between Jack and Grace, before finally turning and retreating into the woods. Jack watched him until he disappeared from sight, the tension in his shoulders slowly easing. Back inside, Jack bolted the door and crouched down beside Grace, who was still standing guard. "He's gone," he said softly, stroking her head. "You did good, girl. You kept us safe." Grace let out a shaky breath, her body finally relaxing as she nuzzled into Jack's hand. Snow and ash stirred by the fire, their tiny yips breaking the silence. Jack scooped them up and placed them beside Grace, watching as she curled protectively around them. That night, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Jack sat with Grace and her pups by his side. He knew the man might come back, but he also knew that Grace wouldn't run this time. She had found her home, her family, and her courage. And Jack, in turn, had found something he hadn't realized he was missing, a reason to fight, to protect, and to love. For the first time in years, Jack felt truly alive. Together, he and Grace had faced the darkness, and together, they would face whatever came next. Grace's journey from a frozen doorstep to a warm home was nothing short of remarkable. Her resilience, the bond she formed with Jack, and her unwavering devotion to her pups showed the transformative power of love and trust. Together, they faced danger and overcame the shadows of Grace's past, proving that even in the darkest moments, hope can prevail. Stories like Grace's remind us of the incredible courage animals show and the profound impact they can have on our lives. If this story touched your heart, let it inspire you to take action. Consider adopting, supporting a local shelter, or simply sharing this video to spread awareness. Subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with someone who loves stories of courage and second chances. Together, we can make a difference, one rescue at a time. Thank you for being part of this journey.